Most people still believe that if the police don't have a warrant, they can't search you, can't go through your car, can't get into your phone. And I'm going to tell you something that will probably make you uncomfortable because it goes against everything you think you know about your rights. In 2026, in real life, on the side of the road, in the moment, they often don't need one the way you think they do. Not because the Constitution changed, not because your rights disappeared, but because the way those rights play out in real encounters is very different from how people imagine them. And everything I'm about to explain to you revolves around one central idea, one sentence that you need to understand so deeply that it becomes automatic, almost reflexive, something you say without thinking when the pressure hits. That phrase is simple. I do not consent to any searches. Say it again in your head. I do not consent to any searches. Because what's happening right now, what's changed, isn't the law on paper. It's the way officers use ambiguity, pressure, and your own behavior to get around the need for a warrant without ever technically violating the rules. I've sat through hundreds of body cam videos. I've read transcripts where every word matters. I've argued suppression hearings where a single sentence decides whether evidence comes in or gets thrown out. And what I see over and over again is not illegal police work. It's strategic police work. It's officers building a situation where the warrant requirement becomes irrelevant. Here's where this gets complicated. The Fourth Amendment still says searches require a warrant, supported by probable cause. That hasn't changed. Judges still say it. Law schools still teach it. But the exceptions have grown, and more importantly, they're being used more aggressively and more intelligently than ever before. Consent searches, probable cause based on odor, protective sweeps for officer safety, automobile exceptions, search incident to arrest, inventory searches, exigent circumstances. These are not new doctrines. What's new is how seamlessly they're being layered together in real encounters. You get pulled over. It's routine. Maybe you were speeding. Maybe your tag light is out. Maybe it's something minor you didn't even notice. The officer walks up, calm, polite, maybe even friendly. And then the conversation starts drifting. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Anything illegal in the car? And you think this is just small talk. You think this is casual. But it's not. It's data collection. It's baseline establishment. It's the beginning of a narrative. Because they're not just listening to your words. They're watching your hands, your breathing, your eye movement. They're noting whether your story is consistent. They're listening for hesitation. They're building, piece by piece, what later becomes reasonable suspicion, or even probable cause. Now, this is the part most people misunderstand. The warrant isn't the first barrier anymore. Your behavior is. If you say something inconsistent, if you appear nervous, more nervous than the officer thinks is normal, if your answers don't match your passenger's answers, if there's an odor, if there's a visible item that raises concern, suddenly the legal landscape shifts. And once that shift happens, the officer doesn't need a warrant in the way you imagine. They need justification. And justification is a much lower, more flexible standard in the moment. This is where the phrase comes in. I do not consent to any searches. Because consent is the cleanest way around a warrant. No paperwork, no judge, no delay, just you saying yes, even indirectly. And here's the trap. Most people never explicitly say yes. They say things like, I guess that's fine, or they step out of the car and leave the door open, or they shrug, or they don't object when the officer says, you don't mind if I take a quick look, right? Silence becomes consent. Compliance becomes consent. Body language becomes consent. This is the trap. Because later, in court, it's not about what you felt. It's about what can be articulated. And the officer will say, calmly, confidently, he gave me permission, or he didn't object, or he stepped aside, or he opened the trunk himself. And now you're arguing uphill. Let me be honest with you. Saying, I do not consent to any searches does not mean the officer will stop. That's the part nobody likes to hear. That's the part people don't put in viral videos. You might say it, clearly, respectfully, and the officer might still search, and you'll feel like your rights were just ignored. But here's where it turns. In that moment, your goal is not to win the argument on the side of the road. Your goal is to preserve the argument for later. Because if you never say the phrase, I do not consent to any searches, then legally, it becomes much easier for the government to argue that what happened was voluntary. If you do say it, now there's a record. Now there's tension between your refusal and the officer's actions. Now there's something a defense attorney can work with. Now there's a chance. Let me walk you through something I've seen more than once. A driver gets stopped late at night. Minor traffic violation. The officer starts talking, asking questions, keeping the driver engaged longer than necessary. Another unit arrives. A K9 is requested. Time stretches. The driver doesn't know whether they're free to leave. They don't want to seem rude. They keep answering questions. Eventually, the dog arrives. The dog alerts. The car gets searched. Something is found. And the entire case hinges on whether the stop was unlawfully prolonged. Now imagine two versions of that same scenario. In the first version, the driver is polite but passive. They never assert anything. They never ask if they're free to leave. They never refuse consent. They just go along. In the second version, the driver is calm, respectful, but clear. Am I being detained or am I free to leave? And at some point, I do not consent to any searches. Same stop, same officer, same timeline. But legally, those two situations are very different, because in the second version, there's a clearer boundary, there's a clearer record of non-consent, there's a stronger argument that anything beyond the initial purpose of the stop was unjustified. This is how cases are won or lost, not on what feels fair, but on what can be proven. Now, this is the part people don't like to hear, but you need to understand it. Asserting your rights can make the encounter more uncomfortable. The officer might become less friendly. The tone might shift. You might be asked to step out of the vehicle. You might be detained longer. That doesn't mean you did something wrong. It means you changed the dynamic. Because from the officer's perspective, compliance is easy. It keeps things moving. It reduces uncertainty. When you assert your rights, even politely, you introduce friction. And friction makes people pay attention. There's also psychology at play here on both sides. Your body is going to react. Adrenaline will spike. Your heart rate increases. Your voice might shake. Your hands might tremble. And the worst part is, those natural reactions can be interpreted as signs of guilt. That's not fair, but it's real. Officers are trained to look for indicators. And sometimes those indicators are just human stress responses. So your goal is not to eliminate stress. That's impossible. Your goal is to control what you can control. Your words, your tone, your posture. Keep your hands visible. Move slowly. Don't make sudden gestures. Speak clearly, not aggressively, not submissively, just controlled. And when the moment comes, you say it. I do not consent to any searches. Not loudly, not emotionally, not defensively, just clearly. Because this isn't about winning an argument. It's about setting a boundary. Now, here's where this gets even more nuanced. Even if you refuse consent, the officer might still search under another exception. They might claim probable cause. Maybe they say they smelled marijuana, even if you don't believe that's true. They might conduct a search incident to arrest if they find a reason to arrest you. They might impound the vehicle and conduct an inventory search. This is where people say, what's the point then? The point is everything that happens after. Because every justification they use can be challenged, but only if your lack of consent is clear. If you consented even slightly, many of those arguments disappear. Let me give you a real-world style example, the kind that plays out in courtrooms all the time. A man is pulled over. The officer claims he smelled marijuana. The man says nothing about consent. The officer searches the car and finds a firearm. In court, the defense argues there was no real odor. The officer testifies confidently that there was. Now it's a credibility battle, judge versus officer. And most of the time, the officer's testimony carries weight. Now change one detail. The man clearly says, I do not consent to any searches. Now the search isn't based on consent. It's based entirely on the claimed probable cause. The defense can focus directly on whether that probable cause was legitimate. It doesn't guarantee a win, but it changes the battlefield. And in criminal defense, changing the battlefield is often the difference between conviction and suppression. This is the reality most people never see. Rights are not shields that automatically stop action in the moment. They are tools that shape what can be justified later. That's why the phrase matters so much. I do not consent to any searches. You're not saying it because you expect the officer to walk away. You're saying it because you understand how the system works. Now, what if they ignore you? What if you say it clearly and they proceed anyway? You do not escalate. You do not physically interfere. You do not argue endlessly. You repeat, calmly if necessary, I do not consent to any searches, and then you let it happen. Because the worst thing you can do in that moment is turn a search issue into a resisting or obstruction charge. That's a losing trade. You preserve your rights with your words, not with physical resistance. And later, if there's a case, that moment, your calm refusal, becomes part of the record. It becomes something your attorney can point to, something that can be replayed, something that can be analyzed. This is also where body cameras change everything, because now tone matters, timing matters, exact wording matters, and you'd be surprised how often those recordings become the deciding factor. Was the consent clear? Was it voluntary? Was the detention extended without justification? These are not abstract questions. They're answered frame by frame, so you want your words to be clear enough that they survive that scrutiny. I do not consent to any searches. No sarcasm, no ambiguity, no filler. Now let me bring this back to the idea we started with. They don't need a warrant anymore. That statement sounds extreme, but what it really means is this. In practice, officers are trained to operate within exceptions so effectively that the warrant becomes less relevant in everyday encounters. Not gone, not erased, but bypassed through lawful mechanisms that most people don't fully understand. And those mechanisms depend heavily on you, your words, your reactions, your silence. That's why this isn't just about law. It's about human behavior under pressure. And pressure changes everything. So before you ever find yourself in that situation, you need to rehearse it. Not casually, not vaguely, deliberately. Hear the question in your mind. You don't mind if I take a look, right? Feel the tension. Feel the instinct to just say yes to make it easier. And then practice your response until it feels natural. I do not consent to any searches. Again, I do not consent to any searches. Because in the moment, you won't rise to the level of your expectations. You'll fall to the level of your preparation. And this is one of those rare situations where a single sentence, said at the right time, in the right way, can quietly change everything that happens next, even if it doesn't look like it in that moment. So don't wait until the adrenaline is high and the lights are flashing to figure out what you're going to say. Decide now, practice it, and make it automatic.